My friends, last week I finished painting and weathering on this abandoned A7V with a full interior. Now it's time to put it aside and focus on this thing right here. More specifically, the figures that will be a part of this diorama. One of them is a regular tanker, while the other gentleman seems more sophisticated. He's got a cane, a mustache, the whole nine. These are resin figures from Stalingrad, by the way, and the sculpting is truly exceptional. So the first step is to make them squeaky clean. I like to use something strong like Mr. Leveling Thinner or any other lacquer-based medium. You can often see how their finish turns flatter after the thinner evaporates, so that's a good sign. With that out of the way, it's prime time, with my favorite black surface primer. Painting them completely black is a very important step in this process, and thus I like to use an airbrush because it's more precise than a spray can. This allows us to reach even the tightest places, which are logically gonna be the most shadowed. And then a very simple yet extremely powerful spray from above using flat white, or white surface primer. Spraying directly from above casts beautiful and natural looking shadows. You can also adjust the angle if you're after more directional light, let's say from the front or the side. But for my purposes, spraying from above is more than enough. Not to mention it brings out every detail that was meticulously created by the sculptor. There might be a noticeable inconsistency between the smooth and shiny primer and the flat white color, and this type of surface doesn't accept paints at all. The quickest way to rectify this is by giving it a quick blast of some good quality flat varnish. Quick, simple, and it's a perfect base for brush painting. All you're gonna need for that pre-shaded base coat are these 3 bottles. Let's now start by laying down the basic colors. The method I like to use is called glazing, which is basically an acrylic filter. And a filter is basically a highly diluted paint, about 90% thinner, in this case water, and 10% paint. It should have a very faint coverage, and you can always test it on a cork base. So the point of a glaze is to slowly paint over the pre-shaded surface without covering it all up. That's why the paint has to be so diluted. Depending on what type of paint you're using, because some have to be diluted more than others, 3 to 5 coats in total might be needed to achieve the right opacity. It's very important to paint over the surface evenly without the paint collecting around folds and details, because that's not a glaze anymore, that's a wash. Another important note, the black and white pre-shading will always change the tone of the color, usually giving it a faded, sort of washed out appearance. Either that's cool, it definitely is for me because I like the saturated colors, or you'll have to fix it somehow. I never tried it, but my guess is mixing the color with something that's gonna make it richer. Let's say adding yellow to green, so it'll retain its vividness. Anyway, that wasn't too hard, and the pants already have some decent shading going on. Let's now mix a highlight color, and here we'll add some paint drying retarder. It's more efficient to have a very strong, over-the-top highlight, so I always mix them very pale. Because the shading is already there, I'm using this step to just emphasize every highlight, making the effect stronger and, easier to see from a normal viewing distance. Also, it's a good way of picking out small faults and details that are just way too small for the airbrush to pick them out. Using paint drying retarder is very important here because a slower drying paint won't bite into the surface immediately. That's when it creates tide marks and sharp color transitions. A paint that takes a few seconds to dry will naturally spread itself out, and that is enhanced even more in this case because the drying retarder also acts as a flow improver. If you try it out on a wet palette, you'll feel the lower surface tension even when you're mixing the paint. Usually I'm happy with just one round of highlights as it's good enough for my purposes, and if I accidentally overdo the effect somewhere, it can be quickly toned down using a glaze made from the base color. The next step is enhancing shadows and outlining surface details, and for this I always use black-brown color, also mixed with water and drying retarder. There's also a reason I always start with pants, because they're rather simple in shape and usually don't have as many details as the uniform. As such, they make for a good starting point where you can get more familiar with the techniques after, I don't know, not painting figures for 2 months. I always have long breaks because building and painting armor models takes a while. And what really makes the sewing details stand out is painting a bright outline right next to them. I usually mix the brightest color possible for these because they also have to stand out on the highlights. So there's that, and it doesn't require too much skill. Let's now do a quick recap on the other set of pants with a different color. This time, I'll make a glaze from flat earth. Here's what I meant when I said the number of paint layers might vary. Even if you keep the same mixing ratio, I mean more or less, because I don't know how to measure drops of paint and water on a wet palette, but the point is, I needed 5 coats of paint on the first pants, and only 3 on these. And it actually felt like the third layers were already pushing it too far in some places. Next is the highlight, again keeping it very bright and pale. But actually, depending on the figure, brushed highlights can be used to bring back some of that lost richness. It should also go without saying that a figure with well-sculpted folds is gonna be a pleasure to paint, especially in those areas where something interesting is happening, such as the hand in his pocket right here. Then it was again about emphasizing some of the shadows and outlining the sewing lines with black-brown color, and a final highlight along the seam line using something a bit lighter than the highlight we used previously. So that was the easy part, a warm-up lap of sorts. I'm not pretending like these results are figure painter quality or anything, but for diorama purposes, and especially my purposes, it's a nice balance between quality and time efficiency. Let's now take a very quick look at their uniforms. I used the same flat earth glaze on the first jacket, because I think it's a very nice color for British World War I uniforms, although they varied a lot, from very pale mustard to earth brown and military green. Again, this is just a glaze, and the result? It's not too bad, I think. The remaining techniques are gonna be a review of what we already used. I just wanted to point out that this type of clothing requires more time to paint because it's a rather complex surface. There's also more surface detail to outline, and after a while your eyes might even start to hurt, but in my opinion it's all totally worth the effort. Especially when you can paint various insignia, ranks or buttons, as these will add a nice touch of fineness to the piece. I won't bother you with the second uniform because it will be a review of a review of a review. I just painted it in a dull military green color to make each figure unique in its own way. So that's the clothes finished, and I gotta say this technique works much better than painting with an airbrush, because if you're spraying those colors, you have to mask every piece of clothing, and that's not easy on the small parts, but with this approach, they're left untouched, so I can now easily paint them with the same method. This would be the same techniques all over again, so I'll instead talk about something else, because not all details and surfaces are ideal for this method. Some colors simply don't work with black and white pre-shading, and other details might be too small for the airbrush and they simply won't cast their own shadows. Luckily, this pouch isn't one of those, but still, I had to force the shadows more than usual, and then I simply gave them another glaze to tone down everything to a more satisfying finish, so to say. Also, the sculpting isn't always top-notch, especially on the small stuff, and here, some, let's call it cheating with the paintbrush can be essential. There might be even some casting imperfections that were invisible before, or they're very hard to remove, so again, some trickery with paintbrushes can help. And who said dry brushing isn't a legit method on figures? I mean, it's just a chainmail on the tanker's mask, but I couldn't think of a better way. Also, the mask itself is made from leather, and now we're finally getting a closer look at that, because I kinda omitted their shoes. So, you probably noticed how every modeler tries different methods, and once they find what suits them the most, they'll just stick with it, right? You keep using the same techniques and the same colors because it just works, in your opinion, and I think that's pretty cool. That's my case when I'm painting leather, that was my whole point of that, and in fact skin tones as well, which we'll get to in a second, but the point is, whenever it comes to painting leather, I always start with a black-brown base and follow that up with either leather brown or flat brown, and add the highlights with orange brown. A black glaze is also an option when you want darker leather, but I don't know, this looks leathery enough for my needs. So let's paint those skin tones now. Just like with leather, I have this rather simple color palette that provides satisfying results. These three are very good for the base color and for mixing highlights. The blue, red and green will be used at the end for some glazing, and a dark brown is great for shadows. My bottle of brown sand dries to a glossy finish for whatever reason, so I always mix it with about 20% flat base from Tamiya. The first layer is once again applied as a glaze in several layers. These figures are more complicated because they don't come with separate heads, which always makes painting a lot easier. The next step is outlining details and emphasizing shadows. Once the burnt umber is watered down and mixed with the drying retarder, it almost acts as an oil paint wash, flowing nicely around the eyes, ears, lips, and so on. The pre-shading gives skin tones a rather grayish look, so this or some reddish brown is ideal for giving it more richness and also making those shadows deeper. From this point onward, it's about tidying up the shadows and adding highlights. Back in my first few sets of figures, I like to go all in with highlights, and the results were sometimes rather washed out, as if the soldiers spent their entire lives in a basement. Well, I'm not saying I've become better at this, but I'm trying to keep up the skin, well, not just darker, but more contrasting, because ultimately it makes their facial expressions and features easier to read from afar, which is how you observe figures in a diorama. You don't look at the figure as a standalone miniature on a small pedestal, but as a part of the story in the scene, right? Also, highlights are one thing, but glazes make the biggest difference, at least in my opinion, of course. I'm talking about those made from blue, red and green, although the most important ones are the first two. Blue is great for simulating growing facial hair, but also giving the shadows a colder, deeper look. Works really well on their necks. Red, on the other hand, gives the face warmer hues, and thus it's excellent on cheeks, ears, lips, around the nose and eyes. The mustache, as well as the hair, was painted in a dark brown color, and then the individual strands were carefully picked out with a small paintbrush. The final missing details were helmets, which were also glazed over a pre-shaded surface, and I just added some chipping effects to them. The walking cane is a minor detail, but at least we can paint some wood. The base was again black-brown, and then the wood grain was painted with old wood, and then with Iraqi sand. That's my usual color palette for old faded wood, but because this is a nice piece of furniture, I unified it with a brown glaze, giving it a more noble look, So there they are. Everything we've done to this point was painted with acrylic paints. I didn't paint their eyes this time because they're sculpted really, really small and you wouldn't even see them. I certainly didn't. Especially on the tanker with the helmet slammed all the way down in his face, right? Anyway, because I'm mainly an armor modeler, I'm now gonna finish them with some enamel weathering. The first and the easiest step for me, adding rust tones around chipping effects. I don't know much about metal helmets, but if they got banged up, I think they would start corroding a little. Then some subtle earth tones on their shoes and pants. I don't know much about shoes and pants, but if they walked across a battlefield, they'd get dirty to some extent. Okay, just kidding. Actually, combat uniforms might get so dirty you'd hardly tell what's their original color. But on the other hand, I just wouldn't have the stomach to cover it all up with, dirt and grime, all that meticulous shading. And on the other, I'm not skilled enough to pull it off convincingly. So, at least for the time being, I'm gonna be more than happy with just a few dust and mud washes that are gonna, integrate the figures with the groundwork. So, I guess that's it. Simple and quick weathering, and it can be pulled off with just 3 bottles of enamel paints. And that was another figure painting misadventure, presented to you by Uncle Night Shift. To be a little honest with you, I'm starting to feel rather confident in this department. Not because I consider myself a good figure painter, but because I'm pretty much able to achieve the results I'm after. You know, it's no more about, let's see how it's gonna turn out, or whatever happens, happens, but more about, okay, I guess it might look something like this, and then at the end, yeah, that's pretty much what I was after. So I guess finding a system that works for you plays a huge role in this, and for me, it's black and white pre-shading, glazing, using paint drying retarder, and a bunch of colors for specific parts of the figure that I like, such as the leather, wood, skin tones, and so on. So I hope you enjoyed this video and maybe found it helpful or at least interesting to watch. In the next episode, I'll finish this diorama by painting the ground and the trench. I can already see it's gonna be a lot of work because all of the debris and wooden trench walls, but on the other hand, hey, it could also be fun. So I hope you'll join me for that the next week. In the meantime, thank you for watching, my friends, and thank you to my patrons who make this show possible. If you like what I'm doing, want to get more of it, and in return support my work, you can go to my Patreon page and see what kind of rewards would you like. I'm posting there almost every day with updates from my workbench. We can get in touch through DMs and emails. I'm posting 1 week early ad-free videos, so you could watch the diorama come to life right now. Also these beautiful studio photos that you can download in full resolution, and they don't do figures any favors. And last but not least, some real-life references for dioramas, sceneries and landscapes. And, of course, small 3D models for detailing your tanks and dioramas. Okay, friends, my bros and bronettes, painting figures is always so refreshing because it's a break from armor modeling techniques. And now I'm stoked to spray that entire diorama black and start post-shading the groundwork. So, yeah, good times ahead because of the fumes. And you, my friends, stay safe, stay awesome, keep building those models, don't just collect them, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers!